Now let's talk about some of the options that we have for working with the edges and the edge hardness of the pieces of our military vehicles. So even if we have something that's very faceted like this, you can see, although we see those edges as hard edges, you can see the change in direction of the planes there, but the edges themselves aren't really that hard. Even something like this, it looks pretty hard, in real life is not really going to be that hard compared to the hardness that you get with a computer generated edge. So just by comparison, looking at some of the edges in here, you can see how this edge in particular is really sharp edge. It's just a straight sharp line. Now the fact that we used a single line here, it helps us when we go in and actually want to change the shape or move things around and work with the topology, because it's very low resolution. We're able to get that faceted look very easily. But at some point, even though we've cut this apart into panels, we still are working with very sharp edges that aren't very realistic. And so there are several ways that we can change the hardness of the edges. Now we can work with the normals and soften and harden the normals up under normals, but that's not really going to give us what we want. We want to have a little bit of detail along the edge, kind of a place for the light to hit, to show us that those edges aren't this super sharp that we have here. It'll make it look a lot more realistic. Now there are several ways that we can do this. Here on this piece, we've got something that is fairly low res, and let's say we're going to keep this as a polygon object. We're not going to smooth it or do any sort of subdivision on it. We're just going to leave it as is. So in this case, we could do a real simple action here by just selecting these edges, and let me actually select all the way up here, and I'll select this one, and we can go to Edit Mesh, Bevel, and then we can change our offset. So I want to set it to a fairly low amount. We want it to be pretty small. Okay, if you want to add more segments, you can. We can add something like that. And then I'm going to go in with the normals and harden those normals. And now you can see that edge. We don't really see the division there, but we do see it's not quite as sharp as it was before. Okay, because we have that sort of bevel there. Now keep in mind, when you start to bevel edges, where those edges intersect, you're going to sometimes get some unusual topology there. And so just keep that in mind. You may need to go back in and merge vertices together or redo the topology just a little bit. And depending on the angle, you can see where this angle, the bevel actually didn't do too much for us for this particular edge, because the angle is not that great. Okay, so it just depends on the angle of your edges and so forth. You can do it on this lower edge as well. Okay, that's one way to do it. And the nice thing about that is that you're still very low res in here, and you're not worrying about doing any sort of smoothing or subdividing of this piece. Now if you are going to smooth it and subdivide it because you need to get a smoothness in certain areas, but you want certain other areas to be sharp, for instance up here on this sort of piece over the canopy, if we hit 3 to just see what that light looks like smoothed out, you can see that it doesn't really look anything like we want it to look. So in that case, we would want to add edges around here. We could also use creasing. Creasing is not going to be that portable usually. We can see how it works here. If I select all of these edges, let me just select all of these, and in the smooth state we'll go ahead and add a crease to this. Okay, and you have creasing if you're working with sub Ds too. So let's go ahead and use the crease tool, and we'll just sharpen that up. And so you can see I've smoothed it, I've sharpened it up though. Okay, so I don't necessarily like the effect of that. So let's say we want to actually add resolution so that whenever we take this geometry out, we know exactly how sharp it's going to be in whatever application we happen to open it in, because that sharpness is contained within the geometry itself. And so we can come in here, use our insert edge loop tool or any of our polygon tools to start adding resolution. We can come in with our split. So go to our split polygon tool, come in and start to add edges. You could also use extrude in some cases to get those edges added in. Just clean that point up a bit. Okay, so you can see here now we have those 3 edges, and we get a nice hit because the smoothing is taking place between those 3 edges. So you're still getting smoothing, it's just happening between very close pieces of geometry, so you're getting that little highlight there along the edge, which is what we're looking for. Okay, so if you don't want to smooth and you don't want to bevel, you could also use a material to get the same sort of effect. So if we look down here at a couple of these pieces, let's say that we want to add some beveling to these edges. So let's jump into our Hypershade, and I want to create a metal ray material, and let's create a material X, and let's go ahead and assign it to those 2 pieces. And now there is a node that will actually start to round off the corners. So if we go down under Metal Ray Textures, look for the MIA Round Corners node. And to connect this, I'm going to just middle mouse drag it over, and I want to choose Standard Bump right at the bottom. Okay, if I pull this up, should be able to see. I'm just going to connect it into the Standard Bump. So right now, there shouldn't be much of an effect, because inside this node, this radius is set to 0. So let's go ahead and render this and see just what this looks like. And we'll render it in Mental Ray, and we'll go ahead and save it. So now let's change this radius. So let's just bump this up to something pretty high. We'll just bump it up to 10. And then do another render and see what that looks like. So now you can see we're starting to get a lot of softness here on the edges. Now it's starting to get pretty blobby, so it's not something that we want. Now the geometry obviously isn't changing, it's just using this node with the normals to get that sort of an effect. So let's start to dial this down. Let's maybe go half. Okay, and so we'll go ahead and render that and see what that looks like. And it's starting to get a little bit better, but still we're getting almost just a rounded effect on the edge rather than beveled edges. And so we'll go ahead just about half that again and re-render, and we just want to dial it in until we get the edge hardness that we want. Okay, maybe take that down to 0.5 and see how that starts to look. So now we're starting to get a little bit of that bevel along the edge. Let me set that up a bit higher. Get something that's a little bit okay. So we can start to see the difference if we dial that in. Okay. So it's pretty subtle, but you can see there's a little bit of a bevel there. And if you have something with the same material, it's going to try to bevel those together. But this is something that you can use if you don't want to add the geometry in there. If you want to keep it light, you could add this material and then come in and add it to your different pieces to create more of a beveled look versus adding geometry, beveling the edge, and so forth. So just something to think about. Even if you've got something that's very faceted like this military vehicle, you still want to worry about the edges and pay attention to how sharp those are, and you want to have a little bit of a highlight along those edges in most cases to keep it real. All right, so the next thing that we'll look at is modeling some tread detail for the tires. So that's going to be, since this is very almost simple looking, having the detail on the tread is really going to bring this model to life. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at how we can do that in the next lesson.